Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Beyond the GDPR, where privacy compliance is going webinar. Pardon me. Appreciate everyone joining us. I wanted to cover off a few things initially during the webinar, then we could get right into it. Immediately, if you had specific questions, feel free to ask us in the chat panel. We will try and get through them, either if they're topical during the conversation, but minimally at the end of the webinar, we can also cover them as well. Just FYI, this is being recorded and also live streamed on Facebook. Looks like that worked today, so that is excellent. And before we continue, I really wanted to introduce our new guest associate to the webinar, Ms. Orla O'Hannaidh, and she is joining us from Womble Bond Dickinson, US LLP, a really respected law firm in the North Carolina area, I think, and they've been doing a lot of work on the GDPR area. Specifically, Orla has been international for a long time, actually recently, being very busy in the EU and spending a fair amount of time now, I guess, back on this side of the pond post May 25th. So I figured it'd be really great to have her come online, share some anecdotes with us, and also, bring us some feedback about what it was up to the date, and then some feedback about after the date, specifically in the EU, and also what it looks like from this side of the pond. So welcome, Orla. Thank you for joining us. And Orla might be muted. Orla, are you muted? Okay, well, while she figures out her mute issue, we will continue with the presentation and go into a couple things immediately that I wanted to cover in the webinar. I think what's been interesting for us as a software vendor, specifically around GDPR compliance work, is to see the requirements change over time. And I think the requirements changing over time have been variable based on the industry. So I feel that most folks expected May 25th would be potentially a very big bang, so to speak. A lot of churn, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of fines, a lot of activity in general. I think what we saw was a little bit different, which was frankly surprising to me and a lot of other folks, was that it was more of a tempered approach. There was a couple, big lawsuits against Google and LinkedIn, the kind of the standard stuff we've all expected. But, from there, pretty quiet. I speak to a bunch of our customers who were preparing and getting ready for the GDPR, and saw that a lot of them were taking a wait and see approach to see exactly how many data subject access requests they got, for example, exercise some of their existing processes to see if there was some issues, and really dive into a little bit deeper about what the true requirements were. I also saw a few studies, and hopefully Orla can back me up on some of this data as well, that a fair amount of the effort pre-May 25th, so effort being resource, costs, and time, was spent really on the legal and internal compliance side. So not just paying lawyers, of course, but also making sure that things that we're supposed to have done before, like making sure your privacy policy is front and center and it's up to spec and it's compliant, but also making sure that when a data subject access request came in, some of the basic business process and capabilities were in place. I don't think anyone expected to have 10,000 DSARs in the first day. Certainly a few were fearful of that, of course, but a lot of folks have been just preparing to at least have capabilities to answer a few even in the first few days. So that was primarily quite a bit of the work effort we saw by customers preparing for those sort of activities. What we also saw on the technology side specifically was a little bit of preparation specifically on the bigger areas of risk that a business felt they had for GDPR. So, one organization was talking about Orla, I don't know if that was you trying to unmute somebody, but it was definitely echoing. One thing we saw on the technology side was a lot of organizations were focused. Oh, there you are. Hello, who's that? Who's that? So what we saw on the technology side quite a bit was a lot of effort being done on the application side. So more about ensuring that the applications were capable and able to respond. That could be whether or not a search was required or a system needed to respond to a DSAR and have capabilities to go back into the service they were providing. So I'll give you an example, like a big one, right? Google spent a lot of time on a few services, making sure that if they had a right to forget request come in, they were able to fulfill it, but maybe they didn't have the whole organization covered. So a good example of that is, some of the Google Analytics services, for example, which, of course, do a lot of collection of information, but also, they had to have the ability to scan, report, and remove. So, Google itself even didn't have a fully compliant program. They had bits and pieces of the business who were in pretty good shape, others that they had to get to later on. And that's what we saw was, really a prioritization of the efforts and prioritized on risk primarily, what was the big one. So Orla, are you online now?
Hi, Jason. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. I was dialed in on the phone and I was off mute, but I'm sorry that everyone couldn't hear me.
Okay, no problem. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're ready to go into your slides now if you're ready. If not, I can go into mine. Up to you.
I'm ready if you are.
All right, let's do it then. So here is your first slide. You can go ahead now.
Perfect. So, as Jason mentioned, I'm coming at this from a legal perspective. My role has been to help U.S. companies and companies not solely based in the EU help get compliant with GDPR. I'm very careful to say that any company is fully compliant. So first, I was just going to talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground since May 25th, and then tell you what I see U.S. companies doing, which, to be honest, is much of the same as before May 25th, and then maybe mention some other laws that we have, recently passed and coming down the tracks, and how I think, GDPR, it's gotten so much attention, and this is just now the way of life when you're doing business and you're touching any data. So moving on to the next slide. I'm not sure if I'm in control here. Perfect. So I mentioned I'd talk about what's happening on the ground. To be honest, there's still lots of confusion, lots of unknowns. The EU regulators, and each country has identified its own regulator, are still issuing guidance. So for example, the ICO, which is the UK regulator, if you go to their website, they have very, very helpful guidance, I would say. It's fairly business friendly, checklists, interpretations of the law, sample documents, and that's just what the UK is putting out as their interpretation of the GDPR. Other regulators are also giving interpretations. So in some ways, it's trying to comply with GDPR is just a moving target, because there are a lot of provisions that we're not really sure how to interpret them. The regulators are giving us some help, but that's just hard to implement on the ground. Like I said, I'm very hesitant to ever say a company is 100% GDPR compliant, because there's just not full consensus on what that actually means and how you can show you actually 100% comply with GDPR. In terms of complaints, the regulators in each country have absolutely seen an increase in complaints since May 25th. And I've seen some charts where the regulators have self-reported the number of complaints they've received, and it really varies by country. So, for example, if I recall correctly, the UK has received hundreds and hundreds, whereas there were some countries, maybe in the eastern part of Europe, that had only received a handful. Some complaints have been very high profile. I'm sure people on the call have seen it in the news. Max Schrems and his organization against Facebook and Google and so forth. We don't have any examples yet, at least that I know of, how GDPR will be enforced and Article 3 used against a company that's headquartered and based in the US. We also haven't seen the regulators issue any fines under GDPR, and I know we all know that those fines can be very high, so that's what people are really scared about. But some of the regulators, like the UK and the French regulators, they have stated that they are reviewing a number of cases, and they're just in the early stage. I think the French regulator referred to it as the trial phase. And so no decisions have been issued yet against specific companies or organizations, and no fines have been issued. But we do know that they are investigating, and the regulators have said that this just is going to take time, and that's why it's not a huge surprise we haven't seen any fines yet, and it could be another 6 months because, one, the regulators tend to be very understaffed, and as you know, these are really nuanced and sophisticated issues and complex, and there's been so much attention to this that I think a regulator isn't going to bring a case unless they feel quite confident that they have a lot of evidence. And they just want to make sure that they, the first examples are probably good examples, I would say. The GDPR has been used by some enforcement efforts. So, for example, the German regulator in one German state has used the GDPR to stop a company from being able to process personal data. And that example is where there was a webcam over the internet for tourism purposes, streaming folks in public places. And the German regulator essentially shut that down after suggesting that that company make some changes to its settings and did not. And so they have used GDPR in some actions. There's been some indication that if companies are acting in good faith, that the regulators will be more lenient. This isn't written, unfortunately, in the law anywhere. There's no kind of good faith standard. But what I've told many of my clients is that, not everyone has the same resources or time to devote to GDPR, and not everyone can have, the same program that perhaps a huge company has. But let's take some reasonable steps to try to, show good faith that we are trying to comply. And that's usually kind of my approach. And, there are still many organizations in the US and the EU who have not begun GDPR compliance efforts. So that's not unusual. I'm not encouraging that, but that's just the reality that I've seen on the ground. So my next slide, I just briefly discuss, what I see US companies doing, and remembering that I'm coming at it from a legal point of view. And so a lot of the work that we're doing for companies are, documentation and record keeping and updating internal and external policies. So, and these are all requirements by the GDPR. So a lot of the kind of day-to-day work over the last 2 years, and I haven't seen a huge change in what I do now. Honestly, post May 25th, my approach is still very much the same, which is let's put our arms around, what data you have, use, people like Jason who know the technology to do that. But from my end, let's document that. Let's update your public-facing privacy policy so it's GDPR compliant. Let's update or create internal policies if you don't have them. So what would you do if there's a data breach? Let's create a plan about that. Do you have a retention and destruction policy? For US companies, this is a really sticking point because many do not, and that is what the EU would expect. So just trying to think about, okay, well, what information security practices are in place now? Let's write those down so you have an information security policy that you can refer to and train on and update. If you have employees in the EU, a big part is getting that employee a privacy notice. And then thinking about some of the other requirements of the GDPR, whether you meet the mandatory DPO test or whether you should have a local representative. On the local representative, that's where I've seen a lot of confusion, that a lot of U.S. companies think, okay, well, this probably applies to me, but I don't even know who to appoint, and I haven't seen other companies appoint, so taking a wait and see approach here. I'm not recommending that, but that's just what I'm seeing on the ground. So those are, I would say, not much has changed since the last time Jason and I presented on this together. In some ways, I don't think that I think we have more information coming in about ways that companies can comply with GDPR, but we don't have great examples of what the regulators are really focusing on yet. So shifting a little bit away from the GDPR, my next slide is, I thought we would just mention, and Jason, a good idea of mentioning what's happening in California, because there's been a lot of comparisons to California and the GDPR. And I would agree that some people have called California a mini GDPR, and I would agree with that statement. So they're certainly not identical, and there's many differences. I think overall California's law, I don't want to say requires less, but isn't as expansive as the GDPR, but there's also many, many similarities. And I've listed a few on this slide. So for example, the definition of personal information under both the GDPR and the CCPA are very broad, whereas usually in the US, if you try to find definitions of personal information in US statutes, like the data breach notification statutes, they're not as broad as they would include name and email address and online activity. Usually the data breach statutes define PI as, name plus social security number plus, certain financial information plus certain health information. It's a little more specific. So both, California and GDPR look at PI now much more broadly than before. Both laws regulate organizations outside of their jurisdiction, so you don't have to be physically in the borders of California to have California's law apply to you. If you're doing business that affects California residents, even if you're doing that from North Carolina, this law could apply to you. California's law, whether it applies to you, does have some threshold tests, which we don't see in the GDPR, based on your gross revenue and the number of consumers and that and the percentage of revenue you get from PI sales. And so that is a little bit different than GDPR, which doesn't have that type of threshold. Both now California is offering California residents certain rights that if you are familiar with the GDPR, these won't sound new to you. So under California's law, the idea of transparency similar to GDPR, that individuals have the right to know prior to their data being collected, why that data is being collected, the right to request information, the right to delete certain information, the right to know, if that information is being sold and disclosed and, to whom, and the right to sometimes just say no, that you can't sell my personal information. So there are some similarities in terms of the rights that are going to be offered. And, California has often set the bar in the US and foreshadows what's to come. So California, I think was the first state to require an online privacy policy, one of the first states with a data breach notification requirement. And now we have all states have that data breach notification requirement. So I can't guess if it's going to be years or, 10 years before other states follow suit, but I think we'll see a lot of other states seriously consider adopting a law similar to California's, perhaps with some tweaks to it. And, aside from, and like GDPR as well, that under California law, violation can lead to liability, including both fines. The fines are smaller under California's law than GDPR. And individuals, if they feel like a company hasn't complied with a statute, can bring a private right of action similar to GDPR. So, I think what's really changed perhaps the most in the last few months has been seeing this California law now on U.S. home turf. And so we've had a lot of companies who've said, complying with GDPR has been a process. It's been difficult, but it did give us maybe a leg up in now thinking about how we have to comply with California's law. And then, we've seen just globally some other laws that I kind of maybe flag for you in case you're interested. But, in India, there's movement on a personal data protection bill. This year, there was a Supreme Court decision that stated that privacy is a fundamental right in India. And now a committee is working on a data bill for India. And that has a lot of similarities to GDPR in terms of the rights that individuals will have, fines that can be levied, I think currently is a requirement about having an annual audit from a third party each year. There's language about having to maintain records, and the Indian law can apply to businesses outside of India if they're doing business in India. So there's also a lot of interest has been given to the language in the Indian bill that talks about having, and I'm not, don't pretend to be an expert in Indian law, so I'm not an expert on this data protection bill, but these are just some of the points that have been identified by other privacy attorneys who are watching this. But there's language about, if data is transferred outside of India, one copy has to be kept in a server in India. And then when you're looking at certain critical data, it may be that data can't even be transferred outside of India. So this could have an effect on a lot of companies with presence in India. Similarly, Canada is updating its law with a mandatory breach reporting requirement and some record keeping points. You may have seen in the news about Japan. For those of you who deal with data across borders, the EU is very strict about if you're going to transfer data outside of the EU, you have to have certain legal mechanisms in place. And for countries that meet the EU's kind of standards, you don't need to do anything more. So for example, data can go from the EU to Canada because the Europeans have said that Canada has sufficient protections in place. And right now the EU is working with Japan on adding Japan to that list. So Japan has been in the news recently. So that's sort of a very quick overview of what's happening both on the ground in the EU and what I've seen happening here on the ground in the US. And I'm more than happy to take any questions whenever Jason opens up the floor to questions.
That's great, Orla. Thanks very much. Definitely learned a few things there for myself as well. A question I have even in the British Airways context of their most recent breach, we saw a notification go out pretty quickly and some continued, updates about the process and these sort of things. Has that been, reflective of some of the GDPR requirements, do you feel, or, BA probably would have had some of the stuff in place, but did you feel that, some of these changes are actually motivating organizations to be a little bit different about how they're approaching this?
Yeah, that is a really great example, and I probably should have thought to bring that up. I absolutely think that GDPR is why companies are being very quick to report to the regulator data breaches. I think more so than before, because I think companies and even clients, I've had a few data breaches come up in the last few weeks and affecting individuals in the EU. And before there wasn't a EU-wide data breach obligation. That is actually the one place where here in the US our laws were ahead. And so now I think companies are really scared. They'd rather just report it and versus trying to find reasons. Because there is, in the data breach law, even under the GDPR, there is some kind of analysis you can do about, well, what's the risk of harm? And I think that companies are erring on the side of, look, let's just report it. Let's be transparent. Even if maybe legally we don't have to, but we feel like we should, because we don't want to come to the attention of the regulators. So I think that even talking to some clients about, some internal security incidents and whether technically they're data breaches, the clients and UK counsel that I work with regularly, because we have attorneys in the UK, their advice is let's err on the side of reporting and just telling the regulator, and we feel like the regulator will look more favorably on that. So I definitely think that's what's happening with BA and other companies.
Right. Yeah, I think it's and much like we saw with the California data breach notification law as well. I support the view that California is kind of the leader in a lot of new policies and legislation that is rolled out, nationally. And we saw, up until recently, of course, data breaches generally weren't even being reported on in a lot of cases. And we're starting to see a higher frequency of faster reporting and more in-depth reporting. Equifax aside, of course, there have been others who have happened since, and they've been reported almost instantaneously, which I think is good. I'm also seeing a lot of organizations actually having a breach and incident response communications plan and engagement methodology. Right? It's not always just signing you up for free credit monitoring. It might be just to indicate what kind of data was taken or lost, and how it's been used since, right, as another indication of transparency to the customers as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there has been, just final thought on that, there's been some interesting discussion on, I think there was one recent article about, is it somehow doing more harm when you put everyone on notice that there's been a data breach that really is unlikely to result in any harm, but we want to be transparent and notify the individuals? There's been some discussion about could that lead to more harm. But I think, California has a template data breach response letter, and they would expect that when there's been a data breach, and there is some analysis about what constitutes a data breach, it varies state by state. And like I said, about half the states, you do a risk of harm analysis. Other states are a little more stringent about if it meets the definition, you have to report no matter what. But a lot of people follow California's model letter, which is where you give some details about, when it happened, when you found out about it, what data is at issue, and giving people, California requires that you might offer credit monitoring services and giving people a hotline. And so, I mean, it is for anyone who's had to deal with that. It can be very difficult to wrap your arms around what happened quickly, especially if you have a lot of vendors and it happened, affecting multiple vendors. And so it can be really hard to meet some of those timing requirements. So I do think having some sort of policy in place so that you don't lose time can be useful, even if it's just a few bullets is useful.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the concept of the template, right? I think it helps to solidify the requirements that they have to conform to, and no business likes uncertainty for sure. And when you actually have rules and regs and actual data points to communicate and fill out, you're going to be able to engineer your process more specifically to that, and of course measure your capability, your competence as well. So I think it's I don't think anyone here would disagree that having more defined requirements, specificity would be much better for everybody involved. So that's a good point as well. Good. What I wanted to do was spend a little bit on we've heard some great feedback on, the legal context and some of the process work that's been happening before and after. And as Orla indicated, certainly it hasn't changed too much from what's going on. All those activities pretty well still need to be done. I think what we're also seeing is, from our perspective as well, as the conversation, earlier this year was very much EU focused, very much GDPR, very much preparation work. And what we're seeing now is a lot of the EU conversations we're having are flipping over to engagement and execution, right? I think a lot of the work up front was just getting ready and actually having something in place versus having a deep capability and much more technology or even process to help. We're seeing that same uptick in the US as well. In South America, for sure, we're seeing a large uptick in conversations there. The Brazilians have passed that most recent law as well. And I think we're seeing a few other countries looking at it. And of course, Canada has upgraded their PIPEDA law as well with, they've tabled new legislation to reinforce the PIPA law a little bit and add more of a defined penalty range. So somewhere around the range of GDPR, actually. So a little bit of movement there north of the border as well. But in all cases, what we're seeing is that, from a data perspective, GDPR kind of has, a couple requirements that are really uniform across all of them. So what we've seen, once my clicky thing here works, is, number one, you need to have some sort of discovery capability. And I want to really call this out to everyone here to make sure that you understand the difference, or, separate the marketing from the actual requirement. You'll have a lot of vendors, and providers saying we're GDPR compliant. As Orla said, that's a really hard word to say and probably shouldn't be used at all. And in reality, what a lot of those folks are doing are identifying areas where PI or PII might be stored, okay? And for us, it's kind of table stakes. That's okay. You might think, this file share or this database has some privacy information in it, okay? Fine. But in reality, when you look at, most of these privacy laws, you have to have the discovery capability for explicit PII, right? You need to find information about a person specifically when they request it. So you need to have the discovery capability that supports the explicit capability of searching and finding it. And you also need the capability to have a data catalog of sorts. Some organizations are really good at this. They've got, every database inventory. They've got them all classified. They know exactly what's in them. They know who accesses them. And they have a very good governance program around access control and, dumping the database onto a hard drive, or, egressing any sort of data. What we're finding, though, is a lot of organizations don't have that capability very well exercised within the borders of their IT infrastructure. In a lot of cases, they don't even know how many databases they have, never mind what's in them. So a lot of folks are looking towards technology, and ours or others, who do a couple things. One of them is, cataloging your data stores, which could be as simple as, finding them, but also classifying them as well. GDPR specifically, and the rest of them have different verbiage for it. But, GDPR is calling out explicitly for classification of your data stores. And the classification requirement is primarily to have, for you, the, data steward, data owner, the organization, to have an understanding of where some sensitive information might be. And in the event of a breach, whether it's, from the outside or the inside, having the capability to understand what was egressed or what was lost in that data set. So cataloging is really important. And we're finding that up-to-date and accurate cataloging is just as important as well. So you want to have something that's going to be continuously classifying the data sets and identifying where sensitive information either was or is. We find many times we turn on the scanners against a database. I'll give you a classic example of a CRM database, and you'd expect to find PII in there, sure, right? You're dealing with people, but in some cases we found that there was, the help desk person was storing the customer's credit card numbers in the notes field, for example, of that CRM record. So now you got a much different classification of that data set, and you need to be able to have that classification up to date. You also need to have that discovery capability against that same catalog infrastructure, okay? So you really are looking for an explicit PII discovery capability in addition to an inventory for classification. The other big piece we found is a big requirement for GDPR as well, is having a monitoring and reporting capability, which should be tied to security and audit governance. And, this means different things to different folks. We have a functionality, for example, that says no one from this user group or community should be able to see, data that's classified as PII outside of their country borders. Great example from Orla's example earlier on today. We have those requirements today where we'll say we don't want someone from Hong Kong seeing data in the EU. What we've also done is extend that capability to say we don't want anyone from this user community to see data assigned to a DSAR, for example. Okay, say we're in flight of a DSAR and we're working through the removal process of that data set. We want to make sure that it doesn't appear anywhere else, or certainly that other folks who have no access requirements to it have access to it. So we're seeing that being a pretty big increase in functionality as well. Something that's not talked too much about is the remediation orchestration capability that you might have already within the organization, or how can you automate some of that activities as well. So a good example is we've done a DSAR, it's taking you 30 days to respond, they requested removal, fine, it takes you maybe another 30 days to do that, and 60 days later you close the case, you say we've actioned this request and we're done. Someone who's been off sick for 3 months with their laptop at home comes back into the office and plugs it in, and all of a sudden it's identified that they're a marketing person and they've been doing analytics before they went off sick, and now there's PII data related to a DSAR that was supposedly closed that reappears within the infrastructure. So some of these conditions where data comes back, whether it's that kind of a use case or someone restores data from a backup tape, you have to identify and capture these instances where that data reappears. And we have the capability specifically for that to monitor for specific bits of data, whether it's a DSAR or not, it doesn't matter, but specifically to capture the fact that it has reappeared or more has appeared somewhere else within the infrastructure. And like I said, that's pretty broad. It could be from a laptop and a remote user to somewhere in your cloud data center at someone did a data restore and brought that data back to life. So that's a pretty big requirement as well. But overall, we're finding that best efforts and communicating that and really actioning some of your policies and your strategy and being as accurate, valid, and complete as possible is always a good thing as well. I think, as Orla indicated, a lot of this is perception by the regulator, by the consumer. And, if there are best efforts and you communicate that and, here's our plan to get better and all that good stuff, it might not be as bad as it would be if you didn't communicate and really close down the batten on the hatches and didn't open up some of this information. So we found that, overall, trying or doing most of some of these capabilities and having documented plans for the rest of the functionality that you might have gaps on is probably the best medicine here. So in general, pardon me, Classy Docs, it's a bunch of capabilities in this area. I think the big thing to really call out as well is structured, unstructured, and data in flight are all in scope of all of these privacy requirements. So it's not just what you can find in that application database or the CRM system, it's also what's on everyone's device, whether it's mobile or a desktop, and also where it's stored, in network land. And it could be on a remote file server, it could be in a cloud service provider, it can be in a cloud application. Salesforce, for example, if you would have customer information stored in Salesforce, which is primarily what it's used for, it is subject to GDPR search requests as well. So we're finding that it's not just Word and Excel files or scans in a PDF. It's also everything that's in a database you might have on premise, in your SharePoint, all that sort of stuff, and in your cloud service providers. And I think that's kind of some of the new learning we're starting to see the industry come around to. And we've invested heavily in having capabilities there. So, we can search QuickBooks, for example. We can search MailChimp. We can search Gmail drives and mailboxes looking for this sort of information. And what you're seeing is that we start including all of these platforms. Search has to be done in a specific way, and indexing and some of these other things that other solutions utilize are just pretty big and hard to use when you start replicating the whole enterprise data set and scanning it on a daily basis. So that's a big one, making sure all data in scope is actually being classified and searched as part of any sort of, privacy request capability. What I wanted to show was an approach we've got and we've used for a few customers to help them through the process of classifying their data sets and identifying where areas may have PII and how to action that. So this is a big organization, multi-billion-dollar global bank, and they had a little bit of tagging infrastructure in place. They didn't really have a ecosystem surrounding that tagging infrastructure. So scanning for UK codes, for example, is obviously a very simple thing to do, and you put in a regular expression search pattern for that, and off you go. But when you start asking for things like, as Orla indicated, right, in the US, it's SSN, its last name, its phone number, and email, and that becomes a potential privacy record. So you start combining data sets, it gets much more difficult, and you have to have some specificity around that for the business. So in this case, what we said is we took this organization, we said, hey, we're going to add specific taxonomy to your business. It's a bank, so pretty easy. We can add, basic banking terms and, AML terms and these sort of things into the taxonomy to make sure that we're getting the basic stuff that's in there. And then we're going to take your specific known keywords and patterns that would be required for the business, right? And each organization has their own acronyms and these sort of things we would add to the system. And then what we've also done is said, listen, we're going to take explicit patterns from other islands of information, systems that have information that would help us. So a good example of that is, for example, let's say you're an SAP customer, or you're using a manufacturing system, or you're using SharePoint to manage your documents. Those repositories are full of very rich, sensitive information, and that information set can be used to help you drive classifications and PII discovery throughout the business. So a very simple example of that is, we're going to take the title of every product name from SAP, and we're going to add it to Classy Docs and say, if you find these product names, that's a sensitive information set. Okay, so we can search and ingest data from external sources, pretty well any one of them, and that becomes part of the classification tagging approach. So if you see this here, we've got some mechanized things going on. 1, 2, 3. That's pretty, IT specific, project specific. And then what we tend to do, and it's an optional thing, is we start asking the users to start validating and coaching us through our classification process. So, hey user, we think this Word document is sensitive because we found, 3 part numbers in it. Can you tell us if it is or isn't? And in some cases, we'll have good coaching from users. They'll say, no, because these are public part numbers. But, the other document yesterday I was working on did have the private, to be launched product name in it, and that one is sensitive. So really involving the end user in the process of classification is really important in this case, and we see that having a lot of value. The last bit we do with this system, is kind of ecosystem lifecycle that we do, is we'll train some machine learning with 1, 2, and 3 patterns, okay? So the explicit patterns that come into the system will be trained with machine learning, and then apply the machine learning on top of it with the end user validating of it as well. So the idea there is we would have machine learning understanding, okay, that this is a part number and it came in and initially tagged as sensitive, but, the last 400 times, yesterday basically in a business, that keyword was presented to a user to say if it was sensitive or not, they said it was not. Okay, I'm going to untrain myself about that sensitivity level and learn and go forward. Okay, just quite a bit there on that side. But I think it's a good example of how we've walked through an organization and get them set up and help them understand what a good classification program looks like. And what I'm going to show you now is, had it right here. There we go. Nope, sorry. I had it all ready. There we go. Good. So we have the data discovery and search panel in Classy Docs right here. This is a good example of when you have a DSAR come in, how you would action it and search for it throughout the infrastructure. So in this case, very simply, you're going to enter a text pattern that is important. In this case, maybe an email address, maybe a specific address, and you're going to click search and just let it run. And with this system, it's going to scan for that content against all repositories that are in scope of the platform. So what that means is if it's attached to databases, if it's attached to cloud drives, if it's being run on all laptops in the business, we will scan all those repositories for these keywords and report back. Sometimes it'll take just a few hours. It might take a few days to get all the results in. But the beauty is, in that case, is you have a single view of all results across the business. And in this case, here's our email address, and I'm going to scroll down once it renders here, and I'm going to show and see that, we've got this content in some zip files, some Excel files, a couple different machines, a few servers, right, a couple of laptops as well. And we also saw it in 2 different databases as well. So, in that case, now you can action this and say, okay, I can respond to the data subject access request. I can say, we found you in 4 locations, dear customer. These repositories are being used for, marketing automation. And, what is your action, right? And you can enable that, by doing an export here. You can very simply do other types of actions with this interface, depending on what your process is. But now you've got full visibility against the whole data set. The other thing we have as well is when I covered the capability for discovery notification, this is where, you may have done the DSAR, you've closed the DSAR, you've done, everything related to that ticket, and, 6 months later, somebody plugs in a laptop that wasn't plugged in during the last scan, right? So in this case, you can now set alerts on specific keywords and repositories when or if data reappears. So we're covering, classifying all the data, searching for specific data, reporting on it, and then alerting on it if it ever rediscovers or reappears. Okay, so it's pretty sophisticated functionality there as well. On the data discovery side, and violation orchestration, I guess is the word I'm trying to use here, I'm going to show you the same thing. So I won't spend too much time walking through the UI here. What we can say is, we have users and groups, Active Directory based, we have workstations and servers, and we have full information around either the classification or the GDPR query was run before. So in this case, I've done 2 rules for the Hong Kong user group on this specific file server. I don't want them to have access to any information related to that DSAR request that we processed. Okay, that is something you probably want to do, especially in any e-discovery FOI type request scenario where you've identified your sensitive data within the network somewhere, and you need to either lock it down, move it out, or minimally put additional protections on that sensitive information. So in this case, you can write that rule that says no one from Hong Kong should ever have access to a piece of data that has that query, that data in it. And, that's much different than saying don't have access to a file share because, in this case, they might have access to a data because the technical permissions allow them to have it. So we got a lot of capabilities on that side, doing the orchestration and the governance violation reports as well. I'm going to show you just what the classification looks like on a structured side for a second. In this case here, we have a mailbox that we're scanning, which is Gmail. And so far, we've classified it all, and it looks like most of the folders' contents is all internal. And that's been classified automatically, right? So you could change, say an email was put into this mailbox and had confidential information in it. We would scan that and understand that right away. Same thing here. We're actually scanning MailChimp itself and actually classifying the contents of that SaaS-based application. And that's the same thing we will search against from either identifying a classification or searching for specific PII will be discovered against it as well. Just scroll forward a bit through to the listing here, and I'll show you, I think we've got one more SQL Server. There we go, good. So this is a database, and in this case, we got a bunch of different information in it, and we'll see that many of the data tables have different classifications. You know, I would expect the drugs column, of course, to be confidential. I wasn't expecting the city name to have confidential information in it, for example. I'm going to go take a look at that, right? So it's a good discovery capability. It's a good thing to run against the databases to really understand, you know, where things may reside, and sometimes where data might appear that you might not have understood before. On the unstructured data side, I'm going to wrap up with Classy Docs with this one here. You're going to see that we have essentially all information about all files throughout the whole environment. So whether it's on a file server or a laptop, on C drives or a plug-in stick, we're going to be able to classify that content, understand what the classification is, and also pull up all the permissions associated to it. So we have significant information about that. This fits into not just a DSAR request, but potentially a breach notification as well. When you're, you know, say someone drops a table, for example, and walks out the door with it, you could be able to say that, you know, everyone else had access to that file share, here's their permissions, or you're going to be able to say that, you know, here's the 14 IT people who had specific permissions to that data set. So being able to classify continuously and having permissions attached to it is very much part of breach response as well. Last thing I wanted to show you, specifically around WordPress, and I think pretty well everyone here is going to be a known customer of WordPress, is I wanted to show you a new service that we've taken over recently that has inherent functionality for WordPress itself. So we've purchased a plugin called the GDPR Framework. It's available for free. It's on WordPress.org. You can put it on your website today. And what it does is gives you kind of a rapid start for GDPR. It enables you to give a data subject access interface to your end users. It tracks consent for cookies and storage of their personal information. And it also remediates DSAR requests as well for data that's sitting within WordPress itself. So if you're running a corporate blog or any sort of ordering engine, website based at all, it behooves you to have a capability for GDPR. And this framework is one of the leading plugin integrations for WordPress to provide that. So it's pretty slick. It's pretty simple. It works very well. We've had, we have over 10,000 active installs as we speak, and a couple 100,000 downloads so far. And the really, simplistic thing about this is within a few seconds of clicking enable, if you know WordPress, it's pretty simple to do that. You have a good GDPR capability right out of the box. Like I said, you can have the DSAR request portal. You've got the reporting on what's in storage, and you've got all the consent management as well. Past few months, we spent a lot of time on translations, adding some cool new cookie features as well. And what you're going to see very shortly is this framework integrated directly to Classy Docs as well. So when someone comes into your website and does a DSAR request, for example, instead of just doing the WordPress system data set as a DSAR platform, it will also reach into everything via Classy Docs and pull up anything in the enterprise side as well. So really extending that capability to the rest of your organization, I think, is the best way to summarize that. So I wanted to leave that with you as well. I'll make sure to send out this URL as part of the mail out with the recorded webinar for you, so you understand some of the capability there. And certainly going to include Orla's contact information as well. Her firm's been front and center in a lot of the space, and certainly is going to continue to be very busy with all the new legislation coming in as well. So we're looking forward to that. Just want to see if we have any questions in the channel here. So I know I had a few as well. Let's see. I think I had a hand raised, but I can't see where the question is. I think the one question I did have, Orla, specifically was, are we going to see, privacy enforcement go across the globe? Like, is this really a global phenomenon? Are we going to see some of these other laws crop up? I know Singapore, I think, is looking at it. You mentioned India. Like, do we expect in 3 years the whole globe to have some sort of global privacy solution in place?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it'll be the whole globe. I'm sure that it'll take many years before all countries have adopted something. But I think that certainly, it is going to be the norm now that when you're running a business, that you have to think about the privacy law in that country. Obviously now, there was a privacy law in Europe prior, but GDPR has the role of applying to companies even if you're not in Europe. Canada's law is similar in many ways to GDPR. I mentioned India, Japan. I think that more and more countries are going to adopt this. And so I do think that now when we think about privacy, we have to think about it globally, and when making decisions about rolling out new products and services and opening new offices, kind of on that checklist, privacy has to be beyond that, because each country either has a law, or I think in the next few years we'll have a law on this.
And that's a great point as well on the checklist perspective or new requirements. Certainly now I'm seeing pretty well every RFP, not even from the technology side, but like a B2B RFP, has requirements for privacy compliance and privacy enablement. And what we're seeing is that, let's say a bank is outsourcing, I don't know, AV services to an organization, for example. And normally there'd just be a simple contract and, pretty straightforward. What we're seeing now is, basics of privacy management and capabilities are expected of the service providers as well now. So it's not good enough to say, we'll take care of your data, trust me. They're actually being forced to demonstrate capabilities in this area. And it's much like almost any information security project now is the same thing, where the vendor has to demonstrate capabilities in, information security, access management, remediation, recertifications, audit compliance, all of these sort of things. Privacy management and enablement will be the next thing, I think, for sure. And it becomes a differentiator very quickly when you can't respond to RFPs because you don't have that capability in-house. Yeah, absolutely. That's good. I think the other question I had from a general perspective as well, Orla, are you seeing that, what are you seeing as the average time frame to respond to a data subject access request from your client base? Is it, all decks on hand kind of emergency type of activity like it used to be, I think? Or is it much now concerted, organized, steady state? There's a process and it just takes us this long to get through it. Are you seeing, a pretty wide variety on that?
Yeah, I do see a wide variety. I think some companies, especially those that have a pretty strong and heavy EU presence, are more used to these requests and recognize them more quickly and deal with them. So to give you an example, recently I was contacted by a client that had received a data subject access request, and we're talking about it generally. I hadn't seen the details yet, and so I mentioned, okay, well, we need to it was from an EU individual, so we need to respond within 30 days, and let's, these are the types of things we want to think about. And then when the response did come across my desk, I think that response had come in 3 months prior, so we'd already missed the 30-day timeline.
Cool.
And the reason was just, there was no bad faith. It was just that, the email came in through a generic online customer support question, and the individual that reviewed it didn't see that question.
Yeah.
The person in the email didn't mention GDPR. They just said, I live in X country in Europe. I want a copy of this data. And so
Right.
the individual that saw it didn't have a red flag go up and say, oh,
Right.
this is a DSAR, I need to escalate this. So I think one of the
Right.
best steps that US companies can do that aren't as familiar with getting these is just one, training their staff to identify one in the first place, and so that it can, you know, be escalated, or, you know, use some sort of internal tool that automatically, you know, provides kind of a single place where these DSARs can be submitted and reviewed and identified. Would be a really good practice, obviously, as well.
Right.
But yeah, I
Right.
would say response
And
rates for my clients are still pretty ad hoc, and I wouldn't call it a full-on emergency, but it feels slightly panicked.
interesting. Yeah, I definitely believe that. I would say even if you're well organized, it's still going to be a little panicky, especially when, you know, you have these dates to hit, right? That's the biggest issue, I think, is these are pretty aggressive dates to hit on really any sort of information request. And if you've got of any size, that's tough to do. You know, I was speaking to a chief privacy officer of a small bank, EU based, a few months ago, and she was saying, you know, we're already doing the DSARs on a subject access request in this case before GDPR came in, and you know, she's like, we're responding. I'm not so sure we have all the data. You know, we look as hard as we can. Certainly, we're not looking everywhere, and we have our priority, you know, repository scan quickly sort of thing and report on that. So certainly, you know, to your point again, any all new tech services, locations, offerings, products, whatever, will have to have this privacy stuff front and center in their design and mind as they roll them out, just because it's now such a major requirement. Yeah, perfect. Well, everyone, thank you very much. I think we ran a little bit over time, but I think that was worth it. Orla, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to co-present with you and get the feedback from the legal side. It's always a pleasure.
Same to you, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.